Well, welcome to another episode here in season 2 of 517 EdTech's Digital Instruction Network. We are joined today by Lindsay Burris and Kelly Trout, both of Ingham ISD, and I will go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
My name is Lindsay Burris, and I am a research and instructional data consultant at the Ingham ISD. So what that means is that I get to help our districts use data to better define and identify their problems, and then consult research literature to look for proposed solutions.
And I'm Kelly Trout, also at Ingham ISD, and my role encompasses helping districts with their assessment tools as well as review of data.
All right. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'll recall, Lindsay was with us in season 1, and we talked then about formative assessment. Now, once we talked about formative assessment, we got a couple of requests to also do a follow-up session on summative assessment. We really want to explore some answers to these questions. First, summative assessment is different than formative assessments. We want to talk a little bit about summative assessment, how it plays out in the classroom, and what teachers need to think about as they're building that. Second, summative assessment is one component of a balanced assessment system that supports classroom instruction and teaching and learning. So we want to talk about how summative assessment fits in. We want to talk about the essential components of well-built summative assessments, because of course, anything that you can do well, you can also do not well. So we want to talk a little bit about what it looks like when they're built well. We want to talk about strategies teachers can use to improve their summative assessment structures. And then we also want to talk about sort of how that's playing out now that we're in this hybrid and remote environment. So Kelly and Lindsay, why don't we just get started? How would you define summative assessment for people who maybe are familiar? They've heard the terms summative assessment, formative assessment, but how would you define summative assessment?
As we define assessment, it's the gathering of evidence on what students know and are able to do. We've got a quote here from Paul Black that assessment is merely the means to gather the evidence about learning. As we think about a balanced assessment system, it's important for us to have summative as well as formative. And you'll notice in this graphic that we've emphasized the formative assessment process as more critical to student learning. The summative assessment or assessment of learning should be a smaller portion of our assessment time dedicated to addressing where students are in their learning.
So what would you say if a teacher was saying, okay, so I see formative assessments are there, I see summative assessments are there, and I get that you're saying that we should spend less time on our summative assessments than our formative assessments, but what's the difference?
Any assessment is used to make inferences about what students know and what they can do. So if those inferences are being used to help you decide what steps you can take or what instruction you can provide to help students get closer to mastery, then those inferences are functioning formatively. In contrast, if you're trying to summarize learning and you're trying to give it a final score and you're trying to identify at the end of instruction what students know, then that assessment is functioning summatively. What you do with the data is actually what differentiates summative versus formative.
And this is how it plays out, right? Like a teacher giving quizzes and stuff, or little mini checks or exit tickets in the midst of the learning, right? Among the activities and things like that, but it's playing out formatively because they're gathering that information for the sake of giving feedback and updating their instructional planning. But then at the end, they're going to give a unit test, and that unit test is simply there to summarize, give a grade, report out.
Correct. It's not the assessment activity itself that makes it formative or summative. Just giving students an exit ticket doesn't make that activity formative if you're not giving students feedback and if you're not using their responses to adjust your instruction. And so in the same way, giving a chapter test doesn't necessarily mean that it's summative unless you're using that test to summarize learning and to offer some sort of final score about what students know.
When a summative assessment goes well, what would you say best case scenario?
Yeah, so there are a lot of different purposes for summative assessment. Summative assessments can inform your instruction such that you can reflect on over the course of the whole unit how well your class was able to progress towards mastery. But oftentimes the way that it informs instruction isn't so much your immediate instruction that's coming in the next couple of days, because the feedback that you give students on your summative assessments, like your summative assessments were done at the end, like you don't have additional instruction planned. So it's not necessarily informing their learning on prior content, it's informing perhaps how you teach future content, or even future years, how you teach that same unit to the next class of students. Great summative assessments can also be used to communicate with stakeholders, administrators, parents, other community members about what students know and how well curriculum is aligned between classrooms and across grade levels. Summative assessments can be used for eligibility for special programming. So we know when students are being identified for special education, summative assessments are a really crucial piece to that evaluation and seeing over the course of the year, at the end of instruction, how are students performing.
The thing I would add is that as we develop and progress with our formative assessments, those well-developed summative assessments shouldn't be a surprise. We should know where kids are in their learning when we get to that summative measure.
And that gets at the question of like, how do you know if a summative assessment is actually doing the job it's intended to do, right? So like if you're giving a series of assessments and the students are all performing fairly well on them, and then you get to the summative assessment and a bunch of them suddenly perform not so well on them, right? We've got an issue, right? So I guess that's another question, is how could a teacher be aware right now of how well their summative assessments are functioning as fitting into their balanced assessment system?
So I think Kelly's last point is probably the place to start, making sure that you're seeing some consistency between your formative assessments and your summative assessments. If you're doing formative assessments, hopefully every day. And so as students are completing those assessment activities, you have a good idea of what they know and where they need to head next. So by the time they get to the summative assessment, you should be able to reasonably predict how well your class is going to be able to do. So I think that's the first thing. If your summative assessments are coming as a surprise and you're like, oh my goodness, I didn't realize students would do this poorly, or I didn't realize they would do this well, that indicates that maybe something is broken about your summative assessment. I also think it starts with the creation. If teachers spend time at the beginning crafting really good summative assessments, then they can be reasonably confident that those summative assessments are going to do the job that they're intending to do.
I'd like to add something too. How would you say that student buy-in or ownership of their learning ties into this? Because I think sometimes, the kind of that old school thinking of like, I'm going to surprise, kids with this really tough test question, or maybe something that they haven't seen before. And I've always felt that the formative assessments, as you said, should be predictive of how they're going to perform in the summative. There really shouldn't be any surprises. The student should be understanding that, hey, we're practicing this skill, and so this is what the test will ultimately assess me on.
So I think one of the pieces, certainly student ownership of their learning is important, and how we structure those formative assessments, including self-assessment and peer response. So if we set up those formative measures to provide peer-to-peer interactions, and as well as self-assessments, so that they're monitoring their own learning. And at those formative times when we're not giving a grade and they're not high stakes, kids are feeling safe to ask questions, to seek understanding.
Yeah, I think, Allison, that's a great question. And if you look at Michigan's assessment literacy standards for teachers, one of the standards is understanding that motivation plays a huge role in assessment and getting students to accurately demonstrate their learning. Definitely, in addition to what Kelly has said, I think it's important to remember that like any good assessment is valid, reliable, and fair. And when all three of those components are in play, you're going to increase the chances that students see value in their assessment, that they feel like it's a good representation of what they know, and that they feel confident performing. So when we talk about validity, what we're talking about is the use of assessment results. Does the assessment, or are we using the assessment to measure what it's intended to measure? So like, for example, if I'm giving students an assessment on parts of speech, but then as part of that grade, I'm grading their behavior or the amount of effort that I feel like they put into that assessment, then that's not a valid use of that assessment. We're mixing work habits with academic achievement, and we're trying to use something intended to measure academic achievement to measure both things, and that's not going to feel to students like that's an okay thing to do. Another thing is reliability, which is just consistency, making sure that if different teachers give the same test to the same student, that they would both get very similar scores. Or if the students were to take the tests on separate occasions without any additional instruction or supports, that they would get similar scores. And so students want to know that the assessment that you're giving them is reliable, and fairness, making sure that your assessment is free from bias and that it's not unfairly penalizing certain groups of students. So I think those three things, and then in combination with your student relationships and with making sure students have a good understanding of your learning targets, making sure they understand what it is that your assessment is intending to measure, and that they've had enough time during instruction to make progress and to see their progress, and as Kelly said, self-assess their progress, then the summative assessment doesn't feel quite so intimidating. They know what to expect, and they know why they're taking it.
That really resonates with, actually, I was watching a webinar this morning, and they were speaking specifically about formative assessment, talking about how, it's an ongoing process. But they also said that formative assessment should kind of be looked at more of a verb than a noun, that it is an actual, well, it's an action, right? So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that and how that might connect to or differ from summative assessment.
So I feel that summative is very different from that. Formative should be that process, ongoing, and summative can be a thing or a test that's measured summative, and graded and provides that final information to students. But the formative should be ongoing in a process. And that's part of the piece that I was trying to decide whether I was going to share, because that whole piece of you may have determined it's going to be a summative end, and then you get to that point and more than 50% of your kids get less than 50% of the content. So then some teachers are comfortable shifting that and making that become formative and providing feedback, even though it was intended to be summative. So, but that also gets lots of folks really uncomfortable with that notion, because
Right.
we have a set time frame in which we want to accomplish. So yeah,
Does that ever come back to the creation piece, Lindsay, that you were talking about? Like how I created this, and did I create this in a way that truly was reliable, valid, and fair for all kids? Because
Right.
how can you really create that one test that's going to cover those three prongs for all the kids in your class? So sometimes the summative assessment might need to look different or be created differently depending on the students in your class and the barriers that they're facing, to truly make it a fair and valid and reliable assessment for each one of those kids. Like that's a huge struggle for teachers.
But that gets into the timing component too, because like I understand that the retake element or some of the timing is a piece that can cause some controversy at times, but like you've got to be comfortable putting students in a position to demonstrate the learning that they have done. And if your assessment experience is designed in such a way that you're actually gaining evidence of something else, and the results on the test are actually giving you a window into something else, a student didn't have enough time to complete it, or the format of the test was not giving the student full access to the question, or you had not given the student an appropriate amount of time to learn the material based on a variety of factors, your assessment now is measuring something different than the student learning. that flexibility is, in my opinion, a necessary consideration when we set it as our goal to run these students through experiences that provide evidence of how much of the content they've actually learned. Like, you've got to be able to allow those students to demonstrate that, and that there's just enough diversity of need among the student population that a single experience, it simply can't be counted on to provide that accurate a picture for all of them.
One single assessment is never going to tell you everything you need to know about students, nor is one single assessment a fair representation of student learning if you're putting it into a grade book or on a report card, or if you're trying to use it to designate for students like their performance level. We need to have multiple measures of student achievement that we're using together to make decisions about what students know and where they need to go. So I think that was a fantastic point. I think the other point you made about giving students enough time, that actually impacts your validity. If you're giving students an assessment and you're not giving them enough time to finish it, then trying to use those scores, if you use them, what you're doing is you're actually measuring how quickly students can work and you're not measuring their learning. Now, this doesn't mean that you need to give them an obnoxious amount of time, but a fair amount of time to be able to do what it is that you're asking them to do and to demonstrate the kind of thinking that you're asking them to perform. So Christy had asked about the construction of assessments, and the Center for Assessment, I love this visual that they created as far as like the steps that educators can take when they're crafting summative assessments. And it starts at the very beginning when you're planning your unit and you're determining learning targets. So remember that your learning targets are statements about what you want students to be able to know or do at the end of instruction. And so when we're writing our learning targets, what we really want to know, or what we really want to ask ourselves, is what do we want to claim about what students can know and do at the end of instruction? Do we want to claim that they can balance chemical equations? Do we want to claim that they can write a persuasive essay with certain components? And so then after we've written our learning targets, we need to share those with students. Now, there are developmental ways to share them, but we want to make sure that they have an idea as well of where this instruction is headed, and by the time we get to the end, what we're going to want them to be able to know or perform. So then after that, at the beginning of your unit, you're going to want to start thinking about evidence. What evidence would allow you to make the claim that students do indeed know what it is your learning target specified? Do you need them to perform something? Do you need them to write something? Do you need them to calculate something? Like, what kind of evidence would give you the ability to make the claim stated in your learning target? And so then followed quickly after that is then designing your assessment, like based on your learning targets and based on the kind of evidence that you need, you can then make decisions about the kinds of projects or tasks that would elicit the evidence that you need.
A lot of this takes planning, especially as we're trying to determine our learning targets. We need to make sure that we've got a lot of time set aside for that planning. What I would also advocate is that we need to work to have grade level teams or department level teams working on this together, so that we're not working on those in isolation.
Yeah, and it all relates back to your standards. Your learning targets are derived from your standards.
When I was in the classroom, I taught high school English, and we as a department got together and talked through the standards and learning targets, and just had for days had really rich discussion around what is this target even saying? What would mastery look like for this specific skill? And just those conversations within the same department, took days to kind of reach an agreement on what we should be doing consistently across our grade level. So from personal experience, I agree, and it's not an easy task, but it's very crucial to make sure consistency across your department or your subject area or whatever it might be, to start specifically with the standards and the learning targets.
So how often would you give these formative assessments? Lindsay has said earlier in the conversation that she would give those every day. Like, you should be doing some formative assessment every day. And I think it's a really defensible point. So but with summative, like, how frequently would you say you should reasonably be giving summative assessment experiences?
So I would say that summative assessments need to come at the conclusion of either a chapter, a unit, whatever you're delineating as that endpoint in which you need to measure learning. But I also agree that that needs to be a fluid system. So we may set that, but we need to allow for some flexibility, because we may be ready or need to, or feel the need to move on. But we also need to recognize if our formative assessments are telling us that that a large proportion of our students are not ready to learn, or ready to move on, then we need to potentially adjust that. So it's hard to set rigorous time points in which we collect that summative assessment.
You really shouldn't be giving that many summative assessments throughout the year. I mean, whenever your instruction is planned to end, like, okay, I'm going to end unit 1 and then I'm going to begin unit 2. And maybe in unit 2, I do a couple of review things for unit 1, but by and large, I'm done with unit 1 and I'm now moving on to unit 2. Like, that would be an appropriate time for a summative assessment because it's the end of instruction. But compared to how often you're doing formative, like you don't need that many summative assessments throughout the course of a year.
Can you talk a little bit about retakes, about what the research maybe says, if there's any validity to them? I mean, I understand that it's sort of like blends the formative summative line a little bit. A lot of conversations I've been in with educators, it's even the goalposts aren't always clear about like how to even build a framework to conceptualize the idea of retakes. So do you guys have anything to share on that?
Whether or not teachers offer retakes, really it gets to the heart of what is the purpose of assessment in their classroom. If the purpose is to quantify learning at a specific point in time, then you don't necessarily need to allow for retakes because you have that one number of that one point in time of how students performed. But I think in most classrooms, the intention is actually mastery. Like, we want students to master the standards. And if that's your goal, then I think retakes are a fantastic use of time. We know from developmental research that not everyone learns at the same pace or in the same way. And students learn content at different points in time. And so if we're striving for mastery, if we want to know that students have developed proficiency with the standards that we're teaching, then there's no better way to promote a growth mindset and to give yourself the opportunity to track student mastery than to offer something like a retake. And the research supports that.
And I would add, especially around the student motivation piece, if we're willing to open it up for retakes, we need to be really thoughtful about those retakes. Those retakes should encompass the lack of mastery standards, not the entire encompassment of the assessment. So if I assessed 5 standards on a summative measure and the student demonstrated mastery on 2 out of those 5, then my retest should be on those 3 remaining standards that they haven't reached mastery.
I would add that when we think about retakes, a lot of people think about giving the exact same test again. Mm-hmm. And that's not necessarily what a retake needs to look like. Like, we also don't want students just saying, oh, I missed question 4 and the right answer to question 4 is C. So now I'm going to retake it and I'm going to mark C and that means I've learned it. No. A retake.
They've learned something. They've learned something.
You have learned something. A retake can take on a variety of forms. And when we say we're offering students retakes, all we're saying is that we're offering them another chance to show that they've mastered the content. And so that could be a different question. It could even be a different assessment activity. Like, maybe the first assessment was a test, and now in the follow-up, you're going to let students write a paragraph about that standard or the question that they missed.
What are you trying to report? Like, are you trying to report, like you were saying, a data point at any given moment, right? So this is how my curriculum has performed in terms of helping these students learn by October 1st. And at that point, you need the data point because it's almost more of a check of your curriculum and how effective it's being, more than it is student progress in terms of reporting out anything for their sakes. But if you're measuring it as far as I want to be able to report out whether or not this student has mastered this standard, then the question becomes, okay, on October 1st, the answer to that question is partially. On October 15th, the answer to that question might be yes. But we're only going to know that if we give that student an opportunity on October 15th to demonstrate whether they had. If the only chance they get is on October 1st, then that what we report out becomes the lasting statement about what they know with respect to that thing.
When we offer retakes too, then we need to be thoughtful about our grading. Teachers have a lot of different approaches for how they integrate retakes with their grading, and be thoughtful about what does your grade represent? Does it represent student performance across the semester, or does it represent mastery of the standards?
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful point, Lindsay. And I think there's some controversy around, this speaks to the retake piece of, should we be replacing scores if you have students, retake a summative? And this always brings me back to when we did a lot of standards-based formative assessment, summative assessment work when I was a teacher, and that parachute analogy, I'm sure both of you have heard of it. But it really resonates with me. Like it doesn't really matter to me at what point the student learns how to pack that parachute, but the fact that they ultimately know how to do it at the end. I want someone who is competent at the end of their learning to pack my parachute.
Well, and often there's a combination at times that sort of comes out philosophically as people are talking about their grading, that somehow or another somebody who has learned it first deserves to have some sort of a representation that they were able to learn it first. That's just sort of been built into the system, that like you take this test on Friday, and on Friday, the people who are prepared, who did their job, who took care of business, who studied, who, got it done and did a good job on that testing experience, got their good grade. And I put their good grade in there and everybody's happy with it. But then a handful of students didn't get a good grade. And I think that there's perhaps a presupposition built in often that the reason those students didn't do well is because for some reason they didn't manage their business properly, or they didn't keep up with the work, or weren't paying good enough attention, or didn't work hard enough on their homework. And some of that is true. Sometimes their kids don't always work as hard as they ought to. And that's a true thing. But at the same time too, like at that point, it kind of gets back to what Lindsay was saying earlier, that like, what are we reporting out? Are we reporting out a kid's work ethic? Are we reporting out a kid's preparedness? Are we reporting out the ability that home life has to facilitate good learning when they're outside the classroom? Or are we simply boiling everything down to how well did a kid demonstrate that he had mastered a certain content?
Right. We've talked a lot about motivation this morning, and I think everything that you just said relates to motivation as well. And our current structure, or our traditional structures, use competition as a primary means of motivation. Like everyone needs to learn the same thing, and the person who learns it first gets the best grade, and the person who learns it last gets the worst grade. And competition does motivate some students, but it does not motivate all students. It doesn't even motivate most students. It motivates some students. And so having a philosophy of students needing to do things better than each other or faster than each other is going to be something that very quickly demotivates some of your students.
Also have not talked about cheating.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think in this online environment or hybrid environment, that seems to be a hot topic of the teachers feeling that lack of control, or maybe the distrust our teachers or our students just, Googling the answer or whatever.
Well, this gets so tricky because students have far more time on their hands right now than teachers do. Like teachers are working way more hours than they've worked before. They're tired, they're stressed. Students, not so much. They have way more time to outsmart us. And so we're never going to be able to prevent all cheating. we just can't. Like, students have way too much time on their hands. They're way too savvy. But like Andrew said, how do we create an environment where students don't feel the need to cheat or the pressure to cheat? And that's a hard question to answer, because I think immediately you jump to reducing the stakes, not administering online assessments that have really high stakes and that are going to determine a student's grade, and where they feel like their future kind of rests on this one assessment, or their parents' perception of them rests on this one assessment. But we also, like, we can't eliminate those completely either. And I'm thinking about like final exams. Like, we have districts that require final exams. And that's very much what I would define as a high pressure situation, where students feel as if the results of this assessment are going to be a huge reflection on them as students. It's so tough.
Well, and that plays out differently too. That's not simply a cheating component, although there is some of that, but just this testing anxiety and people getting stressed out about tests, and people having a hard time managing their emotions, and their heart rate gets accelerated, and they're tense and they're nervous and all these other things. And so even if we're talking about, we can talk about cheating and that's fine, but like probably I would think the same type of atmosphere that makes a student feel like they need to cheat will take a different student who maybe won't cheat because they won't feel like that's the right thing to do. But instead, it's going to interact with them in a way that makes them have headaches and lose a night's sleep the night before and feel very anxious and stressed out, and that might be two sides of the same coin.
I have heard, especially in our online environment, that teachers are getting a little creative in that requirement for final exams. And rather than their typical final exam, they're moving more to an open-ended 2 or 3 question to demonstrate the learning that is part of their coursework. So rather than their lengthy 60-question exam, that they're getting creative in this environment.
Yeah, I mean, thinking about when we do have to give a summative assessment and we're worried about cheating, thinking about the variety of assessment activities that are available to us. Tests have traditionally been kind of our go-to in the classroom, but they're certainly not what we're limited to. We can do performances, we can do speeches, we can do essays, we can do projects, we can do portfolios, we can do student interviews. There are a lot of options at our disposal. And so I would, if I was in the classroom right now, I would take some time to explore some of those things. I think another point that I would make is that I'd remember that my summative assessment is part of a balanced assessment system. And so this summative assessment is just, it might feel really high stakes to students, but it's just one small piece of all of the assessments that you're doing in the classroom. And so if students get away with, just a handful of multiple choice questions, like, it's not going to throw off your interpretation of what students can do dramatically, because you have all of this evidence leading up to the summative assessment that tells you what they're capable of doing. I also think getting creative with your question formats, multiple choice, true, false, fill in the blank, those are a little bit easier to Google and to cheat on. And sometimes there's a time and a place for that. Sometimes those are the best way to measure just basic knowledge or understanding. But as you get to some of those higher level skills, thinking about more constructed responses where students are having to generate their own ideas, where they're having to show their work, and where they're having to justify their thinking, not just saying this is the answer to the question, but then follow that up with this is how I know that answer is correct. This is how I got to my answer.
What you run into there, unfortunately, is efficiency. I mean, one of the reasons that the bubble sheet style multiple choice test, I think, has gained its foothold in the system is because it can be graded very, very easily. Like it's a low energy type of experience that's easy to standardize, and the data becomes fairly easy to compile and compare and some of that stuff. So,
So one suggestion around that is certainly not for your final exam, but for your summative measures throughout your course, that using peer responses. So partnering students together and having them review each other's responses and provide feedback. And ideally having some guidance from the teacher, whether it's a rubric or something that they're looking for, so that feedback between the two peers is, has some structure.
That's a really interesting idea. Like, what do you think it would take to prepare students to be able to engage that? Not from a performance standpoint, like they can answer the questions fine because they're used to answering questions, but like from an evaluation type standpoint, like how would you, what type of components would have to be built into the class, or what type of things do you have to do to build the environment where students would be able to do that kind of peer review on each other's work?
Yes, I think you have to start with defining what you're looking for the students. So you have to have, in some cases, it would require a rubric or something that shows the students what you're looking for in a response, so that they have that information. Of course, that would need to be structured in such a way that they understand the process that they're going to go through, but also the actual details of what you're looking for would be shared with them after the assessment.
Deciding in advance your scoring criteria has been shown to reduce the amount of time it takes to score items. So having a rubric or a sample response or something in advance that you're looking for helps. I think it gets back to prioritization of standards. And we've talked about this a lot in a remote environment, how we can't go a mile wide at an inch deep. We really need to think about what are the skills and the knowledge that students need to succeed in the future and focus on those. So I don't need a lengthy assessment for it to count as summative. My summative assessment can be something that's a little bit shorter and that's manageable for me to grade. And I need to focus my assessment on the content standards that are most essential.
I love the idea of including peers and providing feedback on a summative assessment. I think that's so genius. And I think, doing more of those constructed responses, that all plays into the whole UDL piece of allowing our students to be able to show us what they know, by multiple means of expression, and not just, answering a multiple choice question or a true false question. I have to think that there's research to show that true mastery of material comes from more of a constructed type, immediate feedback from peers or a teacher, versus just checking a box or giving us a simple answer.
Yeah, I also love that concept of even having students learn from each other and showing, look at the variety of ways to express what I know and why I know it. And I think I love the idea of using like the different modalities of here's how I'm being assessed, and it's not necessarily typical. I think that down the line, you might be able to start building up a repertoire of like, here are some examples and non-examples of, whatever mastery level, or, you have it, but not quite to that, level 3 or however you want to interpret it. And I think that will allow students to see, well, gosh, I can express it in this way. I can express it in that way. This is where I'm at. This is what I need to learn to ensure that I'm fully there. And that's a lot of upfront work, but like as you get more kids and the years go on, you can build up those sort of samples of quality work. And I think that, I know for me in my own learning, I like to see an example of what's expected of me. And I think there probably are a lot of learners out there that appreciate that as well.
And think about how that immediately plays into student motivation. If I'm able to show what I know in a way that I know I will do well at, and that is a little bit more enjoyable than sitting down and taking a traditional test, I'm going to do better, and I'm therefore going to learn what I was hoping that my teacher was hoping I would learn. And I also kind of feel like this a little bit kind of segues into how do we do a summative assessment in a hybrid remote setting. The traditional teaching or the traditional assessment methods aren't working as well when we aren't in the same room as our students, and being able to give them this traditional test that we have been giving for years. We have to think of a new way to do that now, and kind of thinking outside of the box. I think this whole conversation has probably opened up some ideas of how we can truly assess what we're wanting kids to know in a different way than what we're used to doing because of the environment we find ourselves in.
Right. Christy, one thing I'd add to the conversation of cheating before we move on completely is don't underestimate the power of talking to your students about honesty and being very, very clear, even diving into gray areas and talking about your expectation for integrity and what it looks like to produce your own work, and bringing that up every time you give an assessment and talking about the importance of producing your own work and demonstrating what you know. And there has been research to support that a lot of times we think it's silly and that students are just going to kind of tune out, and some of them do. but for a good chunk of students, having regular reminders that integrity is a classroom expectation, that it's something that I'm going to be looking for, and that it's part of our student-teacher relationship is really powerful.
I've never taught a full classroom. I mean, our assessments in small group therapy is so different from what would happen in a traditional classroom. But now with the current position I'm in, it's always about, the access piece to learning. How do we really truly know that what a student is showing us is actually what they do know based on their disability and the barriers that they face day to day. So that's where I come from with this conversation. And I told Andrew, summative assessment is not something that I know that I experience often in my world.
Like related service providers, PE teachers, music teachers, like you all know how to do a good performance assessment. Yeah, right. And so if teachers have questions, you guys are a good resource.
Or that like outside of the box, non-traditional summative assessment approach.
One more point that I would make is teachers should have confidence that they probably know how to craft a better summative assessment than what they receive from their canned curriculums. Teachers are experts in what they do. They're experts when it comes to knowing their students and knowing what they're ready for and knowing what they've taught. And so the research has consistently shown that the quality of canned curriculum assessments is pretty poor. And so I would say as a classroom teacher, prior to the start of your unit, take a look. If your curriculum comes with an assessment that as a grade level you've decided you're going to give, or as a building you've decided you're going to give, I would spend some time really reading through that assessment, making sure that it's actually going to get the evidence that you said at the beginning that you needed to determine mastery, making sure that you also evaluate it for rigor. Like we have different levels of thinking. We have lower order thinking skills like knowledge and understanding, and we have higher order thinking skills like synthesizing and creating. And there are a ton of different taxonomies, to describe those. And higher order is not necessarily better than lower order. It's just different. But I would say when you're going through your canned assessments, trying to decide like, is this a good thing to give my students? Starting first by saying, well, does this match my instruction? Does this assessment give me the evidence of learning that I need to determine mastery? And then also looking at, is this assessment rigorous in that it covers a wide variety of lower level and higher level thinking skills? Most canned assessments focus on the lower level, and they don't really provide students an opportunity to show the higher level. And so I know sometimes as teachers, having been in the classroom, we can think that like, oh, well, curriculum companies, like they have people that are paid to create these, and they have experts, in assessment that are writing these, and they have researchers. Right. No, as a teacher, you are the expert. And so you very much have the capacity. You are very capable of looking at that assessment and deciding what needs to be tweaked or whether or not it needs to be scrapped altogether and you need to go in a different direction. And so I would say trust your intuition a little bit and know that if you don't think the assessment is a good indication of student learning, then it's probably not.
Well, and in those instances where teachers may be stuck due to policy to giving some of those prepackaged assessments, that doesn't probably stop them from adding supplements to it. I'm gonna add 3 additional questions to this because it does an okay job of measuring certain things, but it leaves this big gap. Well, you don't have to leave that big gap. Like you can fill that in with a supplementary piece to an assessment experience that you can craft.
And maybe the weight you put on that canned assessment can be very different from what you as a teacher construct. I mean, that really can weigh much heavier than that other piece.
Way to go. I really enjoyed this. I thought it was, what came out is that we talk about balanced assessment systems as though that's like a vocabulary term. And to some degree it is, but in reality, what we're talking about is an assessment system that is holistically built to be consistent with the rest of the class, with the way that we do teaching and learning, with the way that we explore content and the way we collaborate with our classmates, the way that we manage our classroom and set up student relationships. Like, it's all going to fit together as a function of those other pieces. And so when you've got students who are willing to take a risk in a higher stakes environment, they're going to be more likely to feel comfortable doing that. If they're in a situation they feel confident in, a community that they know supports them, they know that they're not going to get hung out to dry if they struggle with it. The cheating component and the validity of the assessment and the fairness and all these different components become supporting elements in this assessment experience, but those aren't built into the assessment experience in isolation. They're built in through the whole rest of the course, and the way that you deliver instruction and the way you greet them when they come in and the way that you handle discipline issues and all these various pieces. It's like a whole system that lives together, and the assessment becomes a consistent chunk of that whole thing. All right. So Kelly, last word. Go ahead.
My last word would be where you can involve students in the process, either through self-evaluation or through peer review. But involving students in your assessment process, I think, is key.
Christy, last word.
I want to jump back to kind of our title of the session, the better summative assessment. How do we truly know that it's better and that the information that we're getting from our students is the best information that they have to give us? So looking at how the test is designed and how our students are able to truly express what they know, I think can truly make that assessment better.
Allison, last word.
I agree. I think ensuring that our tests are reflective of what we've been practicing through our formatives, and to ensure that students feel comfortable and confident going into that summative assessment, knowing, yes, I've been practicing this skill, and so this is what I can expect to achieve, and this is what I can show for my mastery on a summative level. I think that builds in a lot of confidence, and it also creates a level of a relationship with student teacher, knowing that, hey, this is an ongoing learning process, and this maybe might make the summative assessment a little less scary for the student.
Lindsay, last word.
I'm going to sound like a broken record, but I would say if you're in a position right now where you're feeling really overwhelmed and where you know that there are 50,000 things you could do to improve your instruction, but you just don't have the headspace to do that right now, I would actually say focus on formative assessment. Like, summative assessment has a purpose, it has value, it is part of a balanced assessment system, but the impacts of summative assessment on student learning are very, very, very small, in contrast to the impacts of formative assessment, which is crucial to student learning. So I would say if you're not in a position yet where you have the headspace to look through your summative assessments and to make sure you're asking good questions and to make sure that your assessment activities are aligned with your learning targets, like, that can come later. It's something that, eventually I would love for you to find the time to do, but that can come later. Start with formative assessment. Make sure that you're building that into your regular instruction, and that you're integrating students into that process so that they also know where they're at on their path to mastery.
Kelly Trout, Lindsay Burris from Ingham ISD. Thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
You're welcome. Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
So to wrap up, just keep in mind that all of the recordings from season 1 and season 2 of our Digital Instruction Network are on our 517 EdTech website, as well as some additional resources and playlists. And we also want to remind you that we have additional sessions for season 2 coming up. We'll be recording these, and be sure to check them out on our 517 EdTech website. I think you'll really enjoy some of the various topics that we're going to be covering with special guests from around the 3 counties. So thanks again, and we hope to see you at our next season 2 session.